I married my high school sweetheart. I smiled in every photo, but the person I loved was watching from the third row. I married my high school sweetheart on a warm June afternoon when the light felt gentle and forgiving, like it was trying to bless something fragile before it broke. The kind of day people call perfect without questioning what perfect actually costs. The sky stayed blue, as if it had been rehearsed. The flowers were pale and hopeful, and every face turned toward me carried the quiet certainty that this was always how my life was supposed to look. We had been together since we were 16, since lockers and football bleachers and handwritten notes folded until the edges softened from being opened too many times. He was my first kiss, my first promise, my first idea of love. And when you grow up inside something, it starts to feel like gravity, impossible to escape, and unnecessary to question. We didn't fall in love so much as we grew into it. Like shoes you never take off because they have always been there. So when he proposed, there was no rush of surprise, no cinematic pause, just a steady yes, shaped by years of expectation, family dinners, shared holidays, and the comfort of knowing exactly how his hand fit into mine. Everyone smiled when I said yes, as if the story had finally reached the paragraph it was written for. On the morning of the wedding, I sat still while someone pinned curls into place and painted calm onto my face, and I stared at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman everyone else seemed to see. She looked beautiful, composed, ready. Inside my chest, though, something pressed quietly, not fear, not regret, just a small persistent truth tapping from the inside, asking to be heard. I told myself it was nerves, because that is the word people use when they do not want to listen deeper. When the music began and I walked down the aisle, my steps felt heavier than they should have, as if the dress carried more than fabric, as if it held every unspoken question I had buried over the years. He stood there, smiling the same smile that had loved me through adolescence and mistakes and forgiveness, and I returned it because smiling is easy when it is expected. I said my vows clearly, my voice steady, my hands only trembling once, but even as I promised forever, I felt another presence like a shadow, shaped exactly like my heart. Third row on the left. I knew without looking I had invited him, because pretending he didn't exist felt more dishonest than letting him witness the ending I was choosing. Part of me wanted him to interrupt, to speak, to stand, to save me from myself. He didn't. He sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady, listening to me marry someone else, and that silence became the loudest moment of my life. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the space and I kissed my husband beneath falling petals, while somewhere behind the joy, the love I did not choose stayed seated and let me go. Do you think silence can hurt more than goodbye? The reception followed the ceremony, the way tides follow the moon. Inevitable, rehearsed, unstoppable, and I moved through it all like someone playing herself in a film she had already watched too many times. People hugged me hard, telling me how beautiful everything was, how right it felt, how lucky I was, and I nodded, thanked them, laughed at the right moments. Because gratitude is easy when everyone else believes you should feel it. My husband held my waist like he always had, secure, familiar grounding, and I let myself lean into that steadiness because it was real, because it had carried me through years of growing pains and shared history and quiet evenings that felt safe. Safety is underrated until you mistake it for love. We danced our first dance under warm lights and soft music, and I rested my head against his shoulder, breathing in a scent I knew as well as my own. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that this was enough. Almost. But my eyes kept drifting, not searching exactly more, like remembering where something had been left behind. Third row left, now standing near the back. He hadn't come close. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't looked away either. He watched me with a kind of calm that felt cruel because it meant he had already made peace with losing me, and I was still pretending not to notice what I had lost. We met years after high school, after college, after I thought my life was already decided. He came into my world quietly through a shared project, late nights, and conversations that stretched past usefulness into something softer, more dangerous. He listened to me in a way that felt new, like he wasn't waiting for his turn to speak, or trying to fix me, or reminding me of who I used to be. He saw who I was becoming. I never meant to fall for him. I never meant to let myself imagine a different life. But sometimes love does not ask for permission. It simply arrives and waits patiently to be acknowledged. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself feelings were just feelings. If I never acted on them, I chose not to choose. Until standing there in white, watching him watch me, I realized that not choosing is still a choice, and it leaves bruises you do not see right away. When the speeches began, I laughed on cue, clapped when expected, dabbed my eyes at the sweet parts, and all the while felt something tightening inside me like a ribbon being pulled too fast. At one point, our eyes met fully openly. No apology, no plea, just recognition. And in that moment, I understood that he loved me enough to let me go, and I wondered if I loved myself enough to have chosen differently. The night ended in sparkles and photographs and promises of a future everyone believed in. But as I drove away with my husband, my ring heavy on my hand, I looked back once through the window and saw him standing alone under fading lights, already becoming the life I would never live. Have you ever realized what you lost only after it was too late? Marriage did not change my life overnight the way people warn you it would. Instead, it settled in, slowly, quietly, like furniture you stop noticing once it has been in the room long enough. We returned from the honeymoon with tan lines and polite stories, and a shared routine that felt familiar because we had been practicing it for years before the paperwork made it official. Morning coffee, together, evening dinners on the couch, weekends planned in advance. It was good. It was stable. It was kind. And yet something inside me stayed slightly unfinished, like a sentence that never quite reached its ending. I told myself this was normal, that no life feels complete all the time, that longing is just part of being human. Still, there were moments when his absence felt louder than my husband's presence. When a song would come on the radio and I would think of how he would have smiled at the lyrics, or when a story at work reminded me of a conversation we never finished. I never spoke his name out loud. Not once. I treated it like a fragile object I could not risk touching because I was afraid it might shatter everything I had built. My husband noticed the distance before I did. He asked gently if I was tired, stressed, overwhelmed. I said yes to all of it because none of those answers were lies, but they were not the whole truth either. Love built on history feels different from love built on discovery, and I was learning that both carry weight just in different directions. With my husband, there was memory, shared jokes, old photographs, a deep understanding of where we had come from. With the other, there had been possibility, curiosity, the thrill of being seen as who I was now, not who I had always been. One night, months after the wedding, I dreamed of him. Not dramatically, not romantically. We were just sitting on opposite sides of a table, talking the way we used to, and when I woke up, my chest ached with a sadness so sharp it startled me. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband breathe, and wondered when love became something you mourn while still holding it in your hands. I never reached out. I never checked his social media. I never asked mutual friends, but silence does not erase presence, it only makes it echo. Sometimes I caught myself imagining what he was doing, whether he was happy, whether he had forgiven me without ever being asked to. The worst part was not that I missed him. It was that I had no right to. I had chosen. I had promised. I had smiled and said vows and accepted congratulations. So I swallowed the ache, I folded it small, I placed it carefully in a part of myself I hoped would eventually go numb. But love that is never spoken does not disappear, it waits. And somewhere deep inside me, I began to understand that the hardest consequences are not the ones that explode immediately, but the ones that live quietly beside you, shaping every day you call normal. Do you think unchosen love ever truly fades, or does it just learn how to stay quiet? The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a question asked too softly to ignore. My husband stood in the kitchen drying dishes, his back to me, and said, "You've been somewhere else lately." I laughed automatically because that is what you do when the truth feels too sharp for the room. "Where else would I be?" I asked. He didn't turn around. He didn't smile. He said, "I don't know, but I feel like I'm living with a version of you that keeps stepping out of reach." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because it was accurate in a way I had worked hard to avoid. I was present in tasks, in routines, in shared plans, but emotionally, I was holding something back, something unnamed, something I told myself was harmless because it had no outlet. We went on dates, we hosted friends, we talked about future vacations, children, maybe someday a bigger place, and every plan felt like drawing a straight line with a hand that wanted to curve. Guilt became my constant companion. Not loud, not overwhelming, just steady guilt for not being fully here. Guilt for thinking about someone else while wearing a ring. Guilt for resenting a man who had done nothing wrong. I loved my husband. I still do. But love is not always enough to quiet the parts of you that know something is unfinished. One evening, I ran into someone from the wedding, someone who didn't know the whole story but knew enough to say, "I saw him there." I froze. My heart stuttered. "He looked okay?" She added, "Calm, calm." That word followed me home because calm meant he had survived loving me, and that realization hurt more than if he had been broken. It meant he had chosen peace over longing, and I had chosen obligation over truth. That night, I lay awake replaying every moment I had dismissed, every feeling I had minimized, every time I told myself, "This is fine." Marriage asks for honesty not just with another person but with yourself, and I was failing quietly at both. I wondered what would have happened if I had been braver, if I had spoken sooner, if I had allowed mess instead of choosing neatness. But wondering is a luxury you cannot afford. Once vows are said, I looked at my husband sleeping beside me. His face relaxed, trusting, and felt a wave of tenderness so strong it almost erased everything else. Almost I realized then that the danger was not that I loved someone else. It was that I had never allowed myself to grieve him. You cannot build a future on top of an unburied past without feeling the weight shift underneath you. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew that pretending was becoming heavier than truth, and that something in my life would eventually demand to be named. Do you think love requires honesty, even when the truth might change everything? I began to notice how often I edited myself around my husband, how frequently I chose the easier answer, the lighter tone, the version of me that fit neatly into the life we had planned. Not because he demanded it, he never did, but because I was afraid that if I stopped editing, something honest and irreversible would slip out. We moved through our days politely, affectionately, efficiently, and from the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, though, I was carrying a quiet double life, not of actions, but of emotions, and that felt somehow worse. I told myself that thoughts do not count, that love unacted is harmless, that commitment is proven by behavior, not by what stirs silently in your chest. Still, I felt dishonest. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old notebook from before the wedding pages, filled with thoughts I barely remembered writing. There were lines about restlessness, about feeling seen, about fear disguised as comfort. His name appeared only once, circled unexplained. I closed the notebook quickly like it might accuse me if left open. That night, I dreamed again. This time I was standing at the altar alone. No groom, no guests, just an empty aisle stretching endlessly forward. I woke with tears already on my face. My husband reached for me, instinctively pulling me close, whispering what's wrong, and I almost told him everything. The words rose like a wave. "I love you, I chose you, but I never stopped loving someone else." They stayed in my throat burning. I said it was a bad dream. He believed me because trust comes easily when it has never been tested. Days passed, weeks. The ache shifted from sharp to dull, from urgent to constant, and I began to understand how people live whole lives beside truths they never touch. Then one evening I saw him, not unexpectedly, not dramatically, just crossing the street. As I waited at a light, time slowed in that strange, cruel way it does when your heart recognizes something before your mind catches up. He looked older, calmer, different, but unmistakably himself. Our eyes met. No shock, no anger, just that same quiet recognition. The light changed. Cars moved. He nodded once. a small, respectful gesture, and kept walking. I stood frozen, my heart pounding because that single nod carried more meaning than any conversation we never had. He had seen me, accepted me, let me go again. I went home shaking, realizing that love does not always demand to be chosen, but it does demand to be acknowledged. And for the first time, I understood that avoiding truth was not protecting my marriage. It was slowly eroding me. Have you ever hidden a truth so long it began to change who you were? After that night, something shifted in me, not loudly, not immediately, but with the quiet certainty of a decision forming before it speaks. I became more present and more distant, at the same time fully aware of every moment with my husband and painfully aware of everything I was not saying. Honesty hovered at the edges of my thoughts like a word on the tip of my tongue, always almost ready, always terrifying. I watched my husband carefully noticing the way he trusted me completely, the way he spoke about our future as if it were solid, guaranteed, already earned. He deserved truth. I knew that. But truth is not just about accuracy, it is about impact, and I was afraid of the damage my honesty might cause. I asked myself endless questions late at night. Would telling him set him free or only hurt him? Was love without full honesty still love? Was silence a kindness or a cowardice? I tried to imagine my life if I spoke. The shock, the pain, the look in his eyes when he realized he had been sharing a marriage with a shadow of my full self. I tried to imagine my life if I never did. Years passing, moments accumulating, a quiet ache growing into something harder. Neither future felt clean. One evening, we sat on the couch watching a show. Neither of us was really following, and he reached for my hand the way he always did, warm, familiar, trusting. Something in that simple gesture broke me. I realized then that love is not proven by endurance alone, but by the courage to let the other person truly know you, even when the truth risks everything. I didn't confess that night, but I stopped pretending to myself. I admitted silently that loving him did not erase the love I had never resolved, and that denying it had only given it more power. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to run toward the other man. That was not the point. What I wanted was integrity, to be whole in my own life, instead of divided by unspoken truths. I began to understand that the choice was no longer between two men, but between living honestly or continuing to fracture myself quietly. The next morning, I woke with a strange calm, not because I had answers, but because I had finally named the question. I looked at my husband across the breakfast table, sunlight catching his face, and felt a deep, aching tenderness. Whatever I chose next would change us, but continuing as we were was already changing me. And for the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to accept that love does not promise ease, only meaning. I didn't know yet how or when or what I would say. I only knew that silence had reached its limit and that something true was waiting to be spoken, whether I was ready or not. Do you think honesty is an obligation, even when it risks the life you built? I waited longer than I should have to speak, not because I hoped the truth would disappear, but because I wanted to be certain that when I opened my mouth, I was not acting from impulse or guilt or nostalgia. Certainty came quietly on a morning that felt ordinary in every other way. I was folding laundry, watching my husband move through the room, humming softly, completely unaware of the storm I had been carrying for months, and I realized that love without truth was turning me into someone I did not recognize. That was when I knew waiting was no longer protecting either of us. That night, I asked him if we could talk. Not later, not tomorrow. Now he looked surprised, but nodded immediately, because he has always taken my seriousness seriously. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where we planned. Trips argued, gently laughed, late into the night, and I felt the weight of every shared memory press against my ribs. I told him I loved him. I told him that part first because it was true, and because I needed him to hear it before anything else. Then I told him that there was something I had never resolved, something from before the wedding, something I thought I could bury but couldn't. I didn't say names, I didn't need to. His face changed slowly, like someone watching a storm approach from far away. Realizing too late it was coming toward them, I told him I had never acted on it, that I never wanted to leave, that I chose him. And even as I spoke, I knew how fragile those explanations sounded. He asked quietly if I was still in love. I paused. That pause mattered. I said, I didn't know how to measure love. When it has never been allowed to live in the open, I said, I knew I had loved him and that I was tired of lying to myself about the cost. Silence filled the room, heavy and endless. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. That almost made it worse. He said he needed time, that he felt blindsided, that he didn't know where this left us. I nodded because there was nothing else I could do. That night, we slept on opposite sides of the bed, not touching, not angry, just painfully aware of the space. Truth creates once it finally enters a room. I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I had spoken, but because I had waited so long. In the days that followed, everything felt suspended: meals, conversations, routines, all happening with a careful distance, like we were both afraid of breaking something already cracked. But beneath the discomfort, there was also a strange relief. I was no longer carrying it alone, whatever came next. At least it would be real. Do you think truth brings relief, even when it brings pain? Time did not heal anything right away. Instead, it stretched moments thin and exposed every feeling we had avoided by calling our life normal. My husband moved through the house carefully, as if learning the shape of a place he thought he already knew, and I watched him with a mixture of sorrow and respect because he stayed. Even when leaving would have been easier, we spoke slowly, choosing words like fragile objects, setting them down, gently afraid of how they might shatter if handled too roughly. He asked questions, not accusatory, not cruel, but searching. When did it start? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Was I ever enough? Those were the hardest ones because there is no answer that does not hurt. I told him the truth as honestly as I could, that love is not always a comparison, that one does not cancel the other, that what I felt for him was real, but incomplete without honesty. Some nights he slept beside me, some nights he didn't. Space became both a punishment and a necessity. I stopped thinking about the other man as a possibility and began seeing him for what he truly was. A mirror that showed me what I had been missing in myself: courage, risk, the willingness to choose discomfort over quiet regret. I understood then that my marriage was not broken because of him, but because I had been afraid to ask myself the questions his presence forced me to face. One afternoon, my husband said something that stayed with me. He said, "I don't want to be chosen by default." That sentence cut through everything. I realized that staying out of guilt or fear would be another form of betrayal, even if it looked loyal from the outside. We talked about counseling about time apart, about what rebuilding would actually require if we chose it together. There was no clear answer, no dramatic decision, just two people standing in the aftermath of honesty, trying to decide whether truth was a beginning or an ending. I missed the simplicity of before, but I did not miss the silence. For the first time since the wedding, I felt aligned with myself even in pain, even in uncertainty. Love had stopped being something I hid and become something I examined, and that mattered. Whatever happened next would not be built on pretending. Do you think love can survive once comfort is replaced by truth? We decided on space not as a punishment, but as a pause, a way to breathe without hurting each other further by pretending clarity would arrive overnight. I moved into a small apartment across town with borrowed furniture and too much quiet, and for the first time in years, my life felt entirely my own and terrifying because of it. The first night alone, I sat on the floor eating takeout straight from the container, listening to the hum of a refrigerator that didn't belong to anyone else, and cried harder than I had at the wedding. Not because I missed him exactly, but because I finally allowed myself to mourn everything at once. The marriage I thought would be simple. The man I loved and wounded, the man I never chose and never stopped loving. The version of myself who thought choosing safety meant choosing peace. Days passed slowly. I went to work. I answered texts politely. I learned the sound of my own thoughts without interruption. Sometimes my husband and I talked. Sometimes we didn't. When we did, there was honesty still fragile, still painful but no longer explosive. He told me he was angry, then sad, then unsure. I told him I didn't expect forgiveness, that I wasn't asking him to wait, that I just wanted him to know I was finally trying to live without hiding. One afternoon, I ran into the other man again, this time in a bookstore, quiet, neutral, almost cruel in its normalcy. We spoke for the first time in years, just a few sentences. He said he was glad I seemed lighter. I said I was trying to be honest. He smiled softly, not hopeful, not resentful, and said that sometimes loving someone means letting them become who they are meant to be, even if it is without you. That was the moment I understood something essential. He was never the alternative. He was the catalyst. Loving him showed me the cost of living half a life, but he was not the solution to my marriage or my unhappiness. I left the bookstore alone and felt surprisingly at peace. For the first time, there was no fantasy attached to him. No, what if no longing, just gratitude and release. That night, I wrote my husband a letter, not to persuade, not to promise, but to thank him for loving me even when it hurt and for giving me the chance to become someone more honest than I had been. I didn't know if we would find our way back to each other or if this honesty would lead us apart permanently, but I knew that whatever future waited for us, it would be chosen with open eyes, not inherited from habit or fear, and that felt like love too, even if it ended in goodbye. Do you think letting go can sometimes be an act of love rather than loss? Months passed, not neatly, not dramatically, but honestly, and that made all the difference. My husband and I met again, not to argue, not to decide everything, but to speak without rushing toward an ending we were not ready to name. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, hands wrapped around cooling cups, and for the first time since the wedding, there was no performance between us, just two people telling the truth. He told me he still loved me, that some days he wanted to fight for us and other days he felt too tired to imagine rebuilding, that trust once cracked does not shatter immediately, but it never sounds the same again. I listened without interrupting because this time, listening was not something I owed him, it was something I chose. I told him I loved him too, that loving him had shaped me, that my honesty was not a rejection but an attempt to stop living as a half version of myself. We didn't promise anything that day, no timelines, no guarantees. And strangely, that felt healthier than vows ever had. We agreed to keep talking, to keep choosing each other deliberately, or to part with kindness if that became the truest option. There was grief in that honesty, but also respect. I walked away, knowing that whatever happened next would be earned, not assumed. Sometimes I think about the wedding day, about the third row, about the girl I was smiling into a future she wasn't brave enough to question, yet I don't hate her. She did the best she could with the courage she had at the time. I don't regret loving two people. I regret believing that love had to be simple to be real. Life taught me otherwise. Love is not just who you choose. It is how honestly you live inside that choice. If my marriage survives, it will be because we rebuilt it on truth, not habit. If it ends, it will be because we respected each other enough to stop pretending. Either way, I'm no longer silent, and that is the ending I needed. Even if it wasn't the one I imagined walking down the aisle, I learned that sometimes the bravest love story is not about staying or leaving, but about finally telling the truth and trusting yourself to live with what follows. That truth did not destroy me. It gave me back to myself. Do you believe living honestly matters more than having a perfect ending?